Welcome back to Fusty Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Elena Brooks never believed in fairy tales until she met Anthony Miller. They were both young employees at Bytech Company, ambitious and determined to make something of their lives. Anthony was charming and charismatic, but it was Elena's intelligence and brilliance that set her apart. Though Anthony worked hard, his salary never matched Elena's. She earned more and climbed the corporate ladder faster. Yet, in their first years of marriage, the difference never mattered to her. She was deeply in love, convinced that love was about sacrifice and compromise, not wealth or power. On their wedding day, Elena promised herself that she would support Anthony in every way possible, even if it meant putting his dreams above hers. Their union blossomed in the beginning. Friends admired how Elena supported Anthony, while Anthony basked in the admiration of being married to one of the most successful women in their company. For Elena, success wasn't something to boast about. She was careful not to make Anthony feel inferior. She believed that together they would grow, build a family, and conquer challenges side by side. What she never foresaw was that beneath Anthony's charm lay a fragile ego, one that silently resented her accomplishments. This resentment, buried deep during the early days of love, would later grow into a storm that would shatter the very foundation of their marriage. At first, Elena dismissed Anthony's subtle remarks about her earnings as harmless jokes. He would laugh and say things like, "Maybe you should be the husband since you make more," before quickly brushing it off with a kiss. But the word stayed with her, quietly gnawing at her heart. She tried harder to make him feel valued, deliberately downplaying her position at Bytech Company and highlighting his contributions, even when hers were more impactful. She thought love meant bending until the other person fell whole, unaware that Anthony's pride demanded more than she could ever give. Meanwhile, Anthony became increasingly sensitive to how others perceived him. He hated when colleagues congratulated Elena on her promotions and overlooked him. At gatherings, he masked his jealousy with forced smiles, but inside he seethed. He began comparing himself to her constantly, seeing her achievements as a reminder of his inadequacies. Instead of being inspired, he allowed envy to fester. Elena's love was steady, but Anthony's began to tilt, unknowingly laying the groundwork for bitterness. Their home was still filled with laughter, but hidden beneath were cracks that would split open the moment tragedy struck. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Elena had prepared a surprise for Anthony. For months, she had been working in secret to buy shares in Bytech Company. Her dream was to surprise him with the news that they could finally become co-owners of the very place where they had first met. That day, she dressed with care, determined to make it unforgettable. Anthony, however, was unusually distant, brushing off her excitement as if anniversaries were trivial. Still, Elena remained patient, choosing to focus on love rather than his indifference. As fate would have it, tragedy struck that evening. On her way to finalize the surprise with the board of directors, Elena's car collided with a reckless driver. The accident was brutal, leaving her body broken and her spirit shaken. She was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. For weeks she hovered between survival and despair, and when she finally awoke, her world had changed forever. Her legs were paralyzed. Anthony, who initially stayed by her side, soon found himself recoiling from the burden. Instead of compassion, bitterness began to consume him, and Elena, once full of light, was forced into the shadows of pain. At first, Anthony masked his frustration with false tenderness, but as days turned into weeks, his mask slipped. He began snapping at Elena for small things, his patience thinning with every reminder of her disability. The woman who once walked confidently into boardrooms was now confined to a wheelchair, and in Anthony's eyes, she was no longer the Elena he married. He forgot the vows he had made, choosing instead to see her condition as a curse. His words, once filled with affection, turned sharp and cruel. "You're useless now," he hissed one night after she asked for his help. Elena was shattered. She had expected his love to anchor her in this storm, but instead, it became the storm itself. She tried to explain that her worth wasn't tied to her legs, that she could still contribute, still love, still fight for their marriage. But Anthony no longer listened. To him, her paralysis had stripped her of dignity and value. He began staying out late, ignoring her calls, and eventually started seeking comfort elsewhere. The man she loved had turned into a stranger, and Elena realized with horror that her accident hadn't just crippled her body. It had crippled her marriage too. Sophia Taylor was everything Anthony believed he deserved at that moment: young, beautiful, and free from a weight of responsibility. She worked in the same company, but in a junior role, always eager to impress. Anthony saw in her what he no longer appreciated in Elena: vitality. Sophia, however, wasn't drawn to Anthony's heart. She saw the man with a promising career, a wife she assumed was out of the way, and pockets deep enough to feed her vanity. Their relationship began as whispered conversations in the office hallways, escalating to secret dinners and weekend rendezvous. For Anthony, Sophia became an escape from reality. She laughed at his jokes, praised him for his smallest efforts, and never reminded him of what he lacked. Unlike Elena, she didn't challenge him intellectually or outshine him. She let him bask in his fragile pride. But Anthony was blind to her true intentions. Sophia didn't care for his struggles or his dreams. She only saw his wallet. Elena, meanwhile, began to notice his absence and the faint scent of another woman lingering on his clothes. Despite her pain, she tried to confront him with grace, praying he would choose their marriage over temptation. But Anthony's heart was already drifting. Elena tried to ignore the changes in Anthony, but the silence between them grew louder each day. She would wait up for him at night, hoping to hear his footsteps return home, but often he came back drunk, reeking of perfume that wasn't hers. She pretended not to notice at first, convincing herself that stress at work was responsible for his behavior. But the truth weighed heavily on her. Her husband was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. Even in her wheelchair, Elena still carried herself with quiet dignity. But inside, her heart cracked with every dismissive glance Anthony threw her way. Despite the agony of betrayal, Elena tried to keep her home together. She cooked, she smiled, and she prayed for the man she once knew to return. She thought back to their vows, the promises they made on their wedding day, and she couldn't understand how love had turned into cruelty so quickly. Anthony, however, had hardened his heart. He saw Elena as nothing but a burden, a reminder of a life he didn't want. He stopped touching her, stopped looking at her, and slowly erased her from the picture of his future. It wasn't long before Anthony's resentment turned into open hostility. He mocked Elena's attempts to stay involved in the company, laughing when she asked questions about work. "You should focus on your wheelchair instead of business," he sneered one evening, his eyes cold and merciless. Elena sat quietly, holding back tears, but his words cut deeper than any wound. She realized that Anthony no longer saw her as his wife, but as an obstacle in his pursuit of pleasure and pride. Her accident had revealed his true character, and the truth was uglier than she could bear. Sophia, emboldened by Anthony's devotion to her, began making subtle appearances in their lives. She left traces of herself, lipstick smudges on his shirt, perfume on his collar, knowing Elena would notice. To Sophia, Elena was a relic, a crippled shadow of the woman she once was, and Anthony was her prize. Anthony, blinded by lust and greed, allowed Sophia's poison to deepen the rift. For Elena, each day became a battlefield, fighting for dignity, fighting for love, and fighting against the overwhelming loneliness that threatened to consume her. Yet she remained silent, clinging to hope, unaware of the storm still to come. Sophia knew exactly how to manipulate Anthony. She flattered him endlessly, feeding his fragile ego while planting seeds of dissatisfaction toward Elena. "Why tie yourself to a cripple when you deserve more?" she whispered one night, tracing her fingers along his arm. Those words burned into Anthony's mind, fueling the contempt he already carried. He began comparing Elena and Sophia openly, cruelly reminding his wife of what she could no longer do. For Sophia, this was victory. Every insult he hurled at Elena meant she had tightened her grip on him further. Elena, meanwhile, watched her marriage crumble before her eyes. She remembered the night she stayed awake, praying for Anthony's career to flourish, the morning she encouraged him when he doubted himself, and the sacrifices she made so he could shine. And yet, none of it mattered anymore. He was lost to her, not because of fate, but because of choice. Her heart ached with the realization that the man she loved had turned into someone she could no longer recognize. Still, she chose silence, believing that somehow love could resurrect what was dying before her eyes. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon. Elena was seated by the window when Anthony dropped a set of papers on her lap. Her trembling hands unfolded them, and her heart shattered the divorce papers. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Anthony, please. Not after everything we've been through. Don't do this to us," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. but his face was hardened, devoid of the man she once loved. "I don't want to waste my life with someone who can't even walk," he spat. The cruelty in his tone pierced deeper than any knife. Elena wept, begging him to reconsider, reminding him the vows they had taken. But Anthony was unmoved. He had Sophia waiting in the shadows, promising him a life of youth and excitement. To him, Elena was an anchor dragging him down, and he wanted freedom. With trembling hands, she signed the papers, not because she wanted to, but because she realized there was nothing left to fight for. As the ink dried on the document, Elena knew that her love had been nothing more than a stepping stone for Anthony's pride. The days after the divorce were the darkest in Elena's life. She found herself alone in the same house they once shared, her heart heavy with grief. The silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of the love that had been stolen from her. Neighbors whispered, colleagues gossiped, and pitying glances followed her everywhere she went. To them, she was the crippled woman abandoned by her husband. But what they didn't know was that beneath her fragile exterior, a fire still burned. Though her body was weak, her spirit was awakening to a new reality. Anthony had never truly loved her. Sophia moved in quickly, flaunting her presence by Anthony's side as if she had won a grand prize. Anthony felt triumphant, believing he had finally rid himself of the burden Elena represented. But what he didn't know was that Elena held a secret far more powerful than any of his prideful dreams. She had quietly secured ownership of Biotech Company before her accident, and though she had intended to share a surprise with him, fate had intervened. Now, stripped of love and dignity, Elena clung to that secret as her final shield. Someday, Anthony would realize the depth of his betrayal, and regret would crush him. Elena spent sleepless nights reflecting on her shattered marriage. The pain was unbearable, but with time, sorrow transformed into determination. She realized Anthony's love had always been conditional, tied to her wealth, her strength, and her ability to make him feel superior. Once those pillars crumbled, he discarded her without hesitation. That truth cut deep, but it also opened her eyes. She no longer needed to beg for love that wasn't real. What she needed was to rise, not for Anthony, but for herself. Sitting at her desk, she revisited the files confirming her ownership of Biotech Company. Every signature, every document reminded her of the power she still held. She was not the crippled wife the world pitied. She was the unseen force behind one of the most powerful companies in the country. Determination replaced grief. Elena began attending board meetings discreetly, her presence masked from the public eye. The directors respected her, knowing she had invested heavily and strategically before her accident. Slowly, she pieced herself back together, preparing for the day the world would know who truly owned Biotech. While Anthony played the devoted lover to Sophia, Elena plotted her silent rise. She didn't want revenge for the sake of bitterness. She wanted justice for every insult, every abandonment, and every tear. She vowed that when the moment came, Anthony would face the full weight of the choices he had made. Anthony basked in the illusion of freedom. With Elena out of the picture, he paraded Sophia around as if she were his crown jewel. He bought her expensive clothes, jewelry, and even a car, believing that her affection was genuine. Sophia played her role perfectly, showering him with flattery and adoration, all while quietly siphoning from his bank accounts. To Anthony, life seemed brighter than ever. He walked into Biotech Company each day with a smug smile, believing himself untouchable. Little did he know that his position in the company was hanging by a thread, controlled by the very woman he had cast aside. Arrogance made him reckless. He ignored deadlines, missed important meetings, and used company resources to fund Sophia's lavish lifestyle. Colleagues whispered behind his back, shocked at his decline in professionalism, but Anthony didn't care. He thought the company owed him loyalty. After all, he was Anthony Miller, the man who had always believed he deserved more. But arrogance blinded him to reality, and every step he took only pushed him closer to the edge. The walls of his false paradise were beginning to crumble, and the reckoning was near. Sophia was cunning. She had no intention of staying with Anthony forever. Her love was for his money, not his soul. She pretended to adore him, making him believe he was her everything. But behind his back, she was planning her exit. Every gift he gave her, she sold or tucked away for her future. She secretly transferred funds from his accounts into hers, making sure he wouldn't notice until it was too late. Anthony was too blinded by infatuation to see the truth. To him, Sophia was a goddess who worshipped the ground he walked on. But even Sophia grew restless. She knew Anthony's wealth wasn't endless, and his arrogance at work could ruin him sooner than expected. Her eyes began wandering toward wealthier men at gala nights and corporate dinners. To her, Anthony was nothing more than a stepping stone. Elena had once been the jewel Anthony abandoned, but Sophia planned to be the shadow that consumed what little light he had left. The irony was sharp. Anthony had traded loyalty for betrayal, and soon he would pay dearly. Sophia was merely waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was announced that Bytech Company would be hosting a grand gala to honor its new CEO. Invitations were sent to all senior staff and their partners. Anthony, eager to flaunt his status, prepared to attend with Sophia. He bragged to colleagues about how important he was to the company, unaware of the truth waiting to unfold. Sophia, thrilled at the opportunity to show off her beauty in front of influential people, spent days shopping for the perfect gown. She imagined herself as the future Mrs. Miller, basking in Anthony's glory. Elena received her own invitation, though hers came with a deeper meaning. The board had finally decided it was time to reveal her as the official owner and CEO of Bytech Company. She sat in front of the mirror that evening, reflecting on the journey that brought her here. The woman staring back was not broken. She was reborn. Though her legs no longer worked, her spirit stood taller than ever. She knew the gala would not only expose the truth, but also serve as Anthony's downfall. The thought gave her strength, and for the first time since her accident, she smiled with genuine confidence. The gala hall glittered with chandeliers, the air buzzing with chatter and anticipation. Anthony entered proudly, Sophia clinging to his arm, both dressed to impress. He strutted across the floor, shaking hands and boasting about his connections in the company. Sophia beamed at every compliment, unaware that the very foundation of Anthony's pride was about to collapse. Guests whispered, eagerly awaiting the moment when the new CEO would be unveiled. When the chairman took the stage, silence fell across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor resilience, intelligence, and leadership. It is with great pride I introduce the rightful CEO of Bytech Company, Mrs. Elena Brooks. Gasps filled the hall as Elena wheeled onto the stage, dressed elegantly, her presence commanding. Anthony froze, his face pale, his jaw clenched in disbelief. Sophia's eyes widened in horror, her grip on Anthony's arm tightening as if she could anchor him to reality. The woman he abandoned, the cripple he mocked, now stood above them all as his boss. Elena's voice was calm but powerful as she addressed the crowd. She spoke of perseverance, of surviving loss, and of finding strength in the face of betrayal. Every word carried weight, and every eye in the room was fixed on her. Then, with poise, she turned her gaze to Anthony. "There are those who once thought I was nothing more than a burden," she said, her eyes piercing into his. "But tonight, I reclaim my worth. And with that, I announce the termination of Mr. Anthony Miller from Bytech Company, effective immediately." The room erupted in murmurs of shock. Anthony staggered forward, his pride crushed. "Elena, you can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. But the board members stood firmly behind her, confirming her authority. Sophia, humiliated, tried to step away, but all eyes were already on them. Anthony had been stripped of his dignity in front of everyone. The man who once sneered at Elena's wheelchair now stood powerless, facing the wrath of his own choices. After the gala, Sophia's demeanor changed overnight. She no longer showered Anthony with affection. Instead, she grew distant, calculating her next move. She knew his career was over, and with no steady income, he was no longer of use to her. Slowly, she began withdrawing from him, making excuses for why she couldn't meet. Anthony, desperate and broken, clung to her, but she had already made up her mind. One evening, Anthony checked his bank accounts and nearly collapsed. Large sums had been transferred without his knowledge. Panic set in as he realized Sophia had been draining him for months. When he confronted her, she smirked, unapologetic. "You thought I loved you? I love your money. And now that you have nothing, I have no reason to stay." With those words, she walked out of his life, leaving him penniless and humiliated. The betrayal was complete, and Anthony finally tasted the bitterness of the path he had chosen. Anthony's world crumbled. Once admired and envied, he now roamed the streets avoided by colleagues and mocked by neighbors. He had no job, no money, and no Sophia. He remembered Elena's face at the gala, the strength in her voice as she reclaimed her power. Regret gnawed at him, sharper than any pain he had ever known. He replayed every cruel word he had spoken, Every night he left her alone. Every moment he chose pride over love. The weight of his decisions crushed him, leaving him drowning in despair. For the first time, Anthony realized what he had lost. Elena had been his true fortune, not her money, not her position, but her unwavering love. Yet he had thrown it all away, blinded by greed and arrogance. Now, crippled not in body but in soul, he faced the emptiness of a life built on betrayal. His nights were sleepless, haunted by memories of her smile, her laughter, and the tears he ignored. Regret had finally found its home in his heart, and it gave him no rest. Desperate, Anthony swallowed his pride and went to Elena. He stood outside her office, disheveled and broken, waiting for her to notice him. When she finally did, she raised her eyes calmly, her expression unreadable. "Elena, please forgive me," he begged, falling to his knees. His voice cracked with desperation as he recounted his mistakes, promising to change, to love her better, if only she would give him another chance. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Elena's heart ached as she looked at him. Once, she would have done anything to hear those words. But now, she was no longer the woman who begged for love. She was stronger, wiser, and whole without him. "Anthony," she said softly, "you didn't lose me because of my accident. You lost me because you chose to stop loving me. Forgiveness is in my heart, but reconciliation is not. I deserve better than what you gave me." Her words sliced through him like a blade, leaving him trembling in defeat. Elena's refusal was not out of bitterness but strength. She had learned that love without respect was poison, and she would never drink from that cup again. Anthony left her office broken, his shoulders slumped, the reality of his loss crushing him. Meanwhile, Elena turned to the window, gazing at the city below. She felt no malice, only peace. For the first time in years, she was free, not from her wheelchair, but from the chains of a loveless marriage. At the next gala, Elena stood before the crowd as a celebrated CEO, her story inspiring many. She was no longer seen as a crippled wife abandoned, but as a symbol of resilience and triumph. Guests applauded, her name etched in respect across the industry. Anthony, somewhere in the crowd of ordinary faces, watched with tears streaming down his cheeks, realizing that he had thrown away the greatest treasure of his life. Elena smiled not for him, but for herself, embracing the life she had built. Love had turned to regret for Anthony, but for Elena, regret had turned into power. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.